And El Carmen Nature Reserve is a very good example of a success of conservation with the interaction of several actors from the private sector like Cemex, from government agencies like the CONAM, and government from both sides of the border.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm lucky enough to be here with Alejandro Espinosa in Monterrey, Mexico. Alejandro, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you very much, Ben, for inviting me.
I happened to stumble across an article not so long ago about a bison reintroduction in Mexico. I hadn't heard anything about this project, known as El Carmen in the north of Mexico. I never even knew that bison had once existed in the northern part of Mexico. And the more I read, the more fascinated I became. I saw that Cemex, one of the world's largest industrial companies, a giant cement producer, had been the progenitor of this extraordinary project, and that not just bison, but also bighorn and mule deer and all kinds of other species have been reintroduced. So I reached out via Mexican friends to Alejandro to find out more about this extraordinary project. Alejandro, can you just give us an overview of what it is you're working on?
Well, thank you, Ben, for the introduction. And basically, El Carmen Nature Reserve is the flag conservation project of Cemex. It's in northern Mexico between Coahuila and Texas, and it's covered international border. And we have been working over there in the last 25 years, and my responsibility is to administrate and direct the actions of that nature reserve for Cemex.
How did Cemex end up managing this extraordinary piece of land? Did they own it previously and decide to put it to conservation, or did they buy it specially for this purpose?
It was bought especially for these purposes, and the reality 25 years ago, Cemex decides to really put hands-on in a conservation project for give something back to nature, and it was made an analysis in all Mexico, and different places were evaluated for see the potential for conservation, and in the end, all the characteristics that is in El Carmen Nature Reserves decide to put the attention in that piece of land in the North Mexico, primarily for the biodiversity that place have. And also something that is very important is the connections between two countries is the wildlife corridor that represents. And also something that was decided is that place is in the area with the lowest human density in Mexico. So that was part of the equation, and the end decide to invest and purchase some land and start the rewilding process over there.
And who owned the land previously and for what purpose?
It was a combination of different landowners. The main purpose of the land was cattle, livestock business, meaning the traditional livestock production of cattle. And also in the upper level area it was a logging operation. So that was the main activities, and also some small level of mining. That was the principal activities.
How much land did Cemex acquire at El Carmen in total?
It's 100,000, 30,000 hectares. So it's a big chunk of land. So you can imagine, putting in perspective, is the same size of Mexico City in area.
And what about the surrounding landscape? I mean, is this effectively the core area of a wilder part of Mexico?
Yes, the surrounding areas, something that is in particularly the areas of where El Carmen Nature Reserve is located are designated as federal protected areas in Mexico. And our neighbors in the United States also have a national parks. So in general, the areas around us are some level of protections. But something to take in account, in Mexico, the land ownership doesn't affect the status of protection, meaning it's federal land protected areas. And around our neighbors are in the business of cattle business, is still around. And also there are communal lands in Mexico that are called ejidos, and they have the traditional ways of store the land. So also we interact in some level with our neighbors, and we have some good relationships and agreements of conservation with our neighbors.
And does El Carmen comprise some land in the United States, which now belongs to Cemex, or is Cemex the owner only of the Mexican side?
In the Mexican side, yes, Cemex is the landowner. We have some agreements with a neighbor that we store the land. And in the United States, is a piece of land between Big Bend National Park and Black Gap Wildlife Management Area that is called the Allen Ranch, while Carmen Nature is owned by Cemex in totally.
And what about physical borders between Mexico and the US? We all heard a lot about Donald Trump's plans for a border wall and all these things. Is there any physical impediment to wildlife moving back and forth across the international border?
It is not. It's if the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo is with time with a lot of water, perhaps it's going to be a physical barrier. But the reality, that is not any real barrier for the wildlife. It is a political boundary that obviously we need to respect. But it is a real way that see how the wildlife cross from one side to the other. For give you an example, the largest black bear population in Mexico is in El Carmen area. And thanks to the effort of the conservation that Cemex and our neighbors have been doing the last year, the black bears now start to repopulate the areas of Texas from Mexico to the United States. The same way, some of the desert bighorn sheep that had been released in the United States end up in Mexico. So that is not a real border or a real barrier for wildlife. It's a single unit of conservation.
Alejandro, can you please describe for me what the landscape looks like in El Carmen?
Can you imagine a Chihuahuan desert? Have you ever been in a Chihuahuan desert? In the lower area is these beautiful landscapes with mountains, hill countries with grasslands and desert groups. So it is a Chihuahuan desert part. But as soon as you start to go to the elevations in the Sierra del Carmen mountains, you're going to start to see forests, oak forest, then pine, oak forest, in the end, just full forest. So you can imagine that it's a sky island, and the island in the top is a forest, and it's surrounded by a Chihuahuan desert. So it is a beautiful desert. And something that you can see, the area is very clear, and you can see at a long, long way to the distance in the top of the mountain. You even can see it in some of the places in the mountain. You can see the United States at the distance. You can see the mountains of Mexico and the Chihuahua and the Coahuila. So it is a beautiful landscapes, and also that particularity is part of the decision that's making decides to protect that beautiful place.
I just can't get my head around the idea that this enormous cement company, Cemex, decided to buy this extraordinary landscape and conserve it. How did that happen? Was it because there was a chief executive or a chairman that was very passionate about wildlife? Or it seems so incongruous. What's the story really of why Cemex made this decision?
Yes. At that time, the decision, we were working with an entity that was Agrupación Sierra Madre, that was led by Patricio Robles Gil. And it was in a very good relationship with Cemex. And, Cemex had been producing books for the last 30 years, and nature books. And at the time, Patricio was the main editor. And the conversation started where we can get more or invest more. And with the advice of several experts related with conservation, advice to Cemex where to invest and start a project to really make the difference in a hands-on. And that's how this evolved. At that time, one of the main executives of Cemex, Mr. Armando J. Garcia, that he was a very good passionate about wildlife, decides to start the commitment to really start that nature reserve. But before that, Cemex had been involved in this conservation aspect since 1993, so it was nothing new for Cemex to take that decision. It was part of the company's philosophy.
But Cemex was lucky enough to have a senior individual that was passionate about wildlife. And it just shows that it doesn't really matter what company you work for or what kind of job you have. Everyone really has the ability to do something amazing for wildlife in this way. Were you involved, Alejandro, in the project from the very start?
Yes, I was invited to participate in the project in the year 2000. But that time, the majority of the land has already purchased, but the part of a start to rewilding the project just start. So I've been involved in this in the last 24 years. And my first involvement of this project is to reintroduce the desert bighorn sheep to the place. So this is how I start to work in this project since the beginning.
And when you started there, how much wildlife was there? Because it had been a cattle ranch. Obviously, the forest had been logged. Were there some species still present in low numbers? I mean, how degraded was the place?
Well, it was very overgrazed. That was a reality. And some of the species that were still present, that's the deers, for example, whitetail and mule deer was in the very low densities. The same with the black bears. So the first process that Cemex decides to do is to reopen the place. All the internal cattle fences that was in the place were removed. Very close to 400 kilometers of internal fences were removed. So the first step was to rest the place from grazing of the cattle, then open the place, removing the fences. And in the end, all the infrastructure that was there for cattle, meaning the water source, water supply, was readapted for the use of wildlife. So that was the beginning. Then it was an intense research about a baseline inventory of wildlife, exactly to understand what we had. Also, we make some historical review about what was in the past over there, and start to understand what was the components of wildlife that needs to be returned to the place, and at the same time start to select some of the areas that needs to get recovered for grassland. So that was the process at that time. I mean, I'm talking about year 2000.
And what did you find in terms of species that were missing, which had been there previously according to records?
Definitely the species that were missing, talking about big mammals, it was obviously the desert bighorn sheep that was absent from the place for more than 70 years, not that far. Also the pronghorn antelope. Some of the species that we find out that the bison was absent from this landscape for more than 100 years. And other species like the Mexican wolf, for give you an example. But the good news is that a lot of the species still present, the big mammals, like the black bears, whitetails, mule deer, for give you an example. So we need to start to restore the habitat before to bring some of the species back. And the first species that were introduced was the desert bighorn sheep that was absent for more than 60 years from the region.
How many desert bighorn sheep did you bring initially, and where from?
We initially bring 45 desert bighorn sheep. They came from Sonora, Mexico, trying to have the same subspecies that we have at that time. And this was in the year 2000, we released the first group. And that was the beginning of the return of that species. So that's very much how we started.
And what's the population of desert bighorn sheep now in El Carmen and surrounding landscape?
It's around 250 desert bighorn sheep. So it's at the limit of, we estimate that this is more or less the current capacity of the species. We don't have a deep intervention, but this is how they are doing. So they are very good and established and enjoying their home.
And do you have the predators of bighorn sheep in the landscape? For example, the cougar or the jaguar or the grizzly bear?
Well, we have mountain lions. They are present in the area. In the place, the grizzly bear is not present. And also we have black bears, yes.
Was the grizzly bear once present in that landscape?
There are some very old records that in some of archaeological records that perhaps at a point that it was present sometime in the past. Talking about more than 200 years.
And is the grizzly bear an animal that you think might return to that part of Mexico in the future?
It might in some areas, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done first. The grizzly bear was extirpated from Mexico in the 1940s. And the last records came from Chihuahua, Mexico. So it's the state neighbor from Coahuila, where the Carmen Nature Reserve are. So there are some areas that perhaps have the possibilities, but it's a lot of work that needs to be done first.
I see that Washington State is looking to reintroduce grizzly bears to a particular mountain range. I think it's called the Cascades, part of Washington. And of course, the symbol of California State is a grizzly bear, but there are none left. Here in Europe, there have been some brown bear reintroductions. The French have brought brown bears back to the Pyrenees, for example, from Slovenia, and the numbers of brown bears are really recovering quite fast in many parts of Europe. So do you think feasibly in our lifetimes we'll see grizzly bears back in Mexico?
It might in some of the north regions in Chihuahua. I've been hearing about some of the projects, but perhaps with a lot of work, meaning in the areas that still have some potential. Also, in a social aspect, doing a lot of work, it is possible. Now the good news in Mexico, the Mexican wolves have in a very good recovery. So perhaps in a few years, the grizzly bear came back to the area.
Was the Mexican wolf reintroduced, or did that survive and then the numbers have just recovered with protection?
No, the Mexican wolves had been reintroduced primarily in Chihuahua and Sonora, Mexico. So at this moment, there are some free-ranging packs. So it is on their way to recovery.
And will they find their way to El Carmen, do you think, in due course?
Eventually, that will be one of the ultimate goals of El Carmen Nature Reserve, to reintroduce the Mexican wolves. But before that, we need to work a lot with the landowners and also with the Mexican government, who is in charge of these projects. We'll need to do a lot of coordination with us, but it is a possibility, definitely.
And what about the jaguar? I mean, I have a brother-in-law who's spent his life working in jaguar conservation in the west of Mexico. And it's an animal which has got some degree of protection in the country of Mexico, partly because of the spiritual association that Mexicans seem to have with jaguars. And then, of course, recently we saw that some jaguars had crossed the border and were living once again in Arizona. So do you think you have jaguars already in El Carmen? And if not, do you think that they'll return to that landscape? This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com.
There are some very old records that perhaps the jaguar were present. Definitely, if the corridor of jaguars from this site is more related to the Gulf of Mexico, all the way north to Tamaulipas and Texas, and perhaps they can connect all the way to the Rio Grande to locations. But I see the habitat perhaps is not in the best quality for a jaguar, that they have more in the tropical area. But I will not be surprised if eventually a record of jaguars can show up of a population that can make the way all from the river all the way to Carmen. So I think in Chihuahua there are also some records that connects with Sonora and Arizona. So, some of the things that I've been learning is that the wildlife, sometimes they find the path to reestablish in the areas that used to belong for them.
So you've brought back desert bighorn sheep. Did you proactively reintroduce the pronghorn antelope as well, or did they find their own way back?
No, it was a process, very interesting process. In the 2008 and 2009, we ended up with a good agreement with New Mexico that they have a surplus for pronghorn from some of the places. So we make a beautiful project to interchange wildlife. We sent 10 desert sheep to reinforce the genetics of the desert sheep population in New Mexico. And in return, we receive 100 pronghorns for some of the areas of El Carmen. And the population had been stable from then. It's some of the places that they are at this moment are not 100% owned by Cemex. It's with our owners that they find a very nice flatlands with grasslands. So that's how the pronghorns came.
And then, of course, the project which which made El Carmen famous, was the return of bison to northern Mexico. How did that come about? How's it going?
It was very interesting that the bison becomes one of the best ambassadors of El Carmen Nature Reserve. And how they come, after 20 years of work in restoration of habitats, meaning grasslands, more than 30,000 hectares of grassland being restored, we start to see the habitat, and the habitat not in a verbal way, but in a biological way, say, I need a grazer here. Meaning the grass needs the animal for start to graze and start to recycle the process. So that was the decision that they said we need this component in the landscape. So we said we want to bring the bisons and give them a job. That means to start to graze the area that has been restored and start to the process again. So we were working on this with the CONAMP, that is the Mexican entity who is in charge of the national protected areas, that have the case that steward the conservation herds of bison in Jano, Chihuahua. And at that time, they have a surplus of bisons. So they say, well, it's time to have a second conservation herds of bison in Mexico. And we start the process to bring a group of bison to El Carmen Nature Reserve. That was on 2019. We brought 90 bisons from Jano, Chihuahua, all the way to El Carmen Nature Reserve. And that's how we start the process. And something that we start to learn is that it was a magic moment, Ben. When I saw the bison coming down from the trailers after being in the road for very close to 26 hours, immediately you can see where an animal belongs to the place. So it was a magic moment when I see those bison start to run around. We left them after a couple of weeks of adaptation and of release, and when we released them, and the animals immediately called El Carmen Nature Reserve home. That's something that it was very, well, let's say the word magical moment. We set with radio collars some of the cows, the females, in order to understand the pattern, how they move. And we learned that these animals start to move around 14 kilometers per day. It was amazing. And something that also caught our attention very clear is when they start to interact with land, meaning how they bat, how they move the dirt, how they break the single start to graze. You can immediately see how the habitat respond in a good way. And also some species that we had been absent in the place, like some of these beetles that are special of the dung, they will start to appear. And looks like the cycle start to renew, So that's exactly what's where we're looking, an animal that belongs dead. And this is a truly rewilding process of the place. So this is how they arrive. Now the population is around 95. It's still a small group, but we expect in time we can have very close to 1,000 bisons around the Cemex properties, helping to the place to get restored. And in the end, those bisons can go for other places in Mexico in order to do the same work that we are seeing they are doing with us.
Do you think there's the possibility that these bison could connect up with other populations in the future? In other words, free-moving bison moving east and west and north and south. Are the grasslands connected in that way? Are there corridors? Is it possible to imagine that kind of a meta-population? Or will it always require the help of humans to move them around?
At this moment, they will require humans to help to connect those populations. But at something that it is real, that we can have a population that give us some glimpse of what was in the past. So that's the good news. And perhaps with good work with our neighbors and some other landowners, that can be a reality of a meta-population that is connected in a natural way. But it will take a lot of years to go there. At this moment, it is good to see the bisons are behaving like bisons in nature again. our way to approach of management is not have a deep intervention, keep them as wild as possible. So just seeing the bison start to show nature behaviors, like how they protect their calf and how they start to move around the landscape, it is a good way to see how the rewilding projects works, and give us the opportunity to see how the nature, if you give them the time and the conditions, can regenerate,
I mean, the reason why I reached out to you, Alejandro, is because I just stumbled across this story whilst looking for good news stories about reintroductions and rewilding. And I love Mexico, and this story of bison coming back to the north of Mexico on a 100,000 hectare project led by Cemex is just completely mind-blowing and joyful to hear about. I also stumbled across a piece that said that the beaver, Castor canadiensis, the North American beaver, has made a return in northern Mexico following some releases on the American side of the border. Have you heard about this? And are there beavers in El Carmen? Because, of course, the beaver is like the bison. It's one of the keystone species in that landscape.
Yes, the beavers, they are present in North El Carmen and the South Bigman National Park. So there is a good populations of beavers in the Rio Grande, in the Rio Bravo. So that they are doing their work. And something that I noticed, if you have the opportunity, Ben, for example, to take a kayak and go all the way of the Rio Grande between Mexico and United States, some of the things that you're going to see is, first of all, that there is not a real border between the two countries. It is a natural corridor. And on the water, you're going to see a constant presence of beavers. So there's a real area when the beavers have some kind of sanctuary. So they are doing good.
And the beaver was extinct previously in Mexico and has been reintroduced in effect.
Yes, it had been in some level put the population in a very low numbers. And in some of the areas had been some projects of conservation, not a real deep reintroduction projects, but something that also you need to realize, the beavers and Mexico are in the limited distribution, so they are never have been very abundant. But something that is true is that the population is start to growing up in numbers and start to recover some of the rivers. And particularly in El Carmen Nature Reserve, it's a very good example of how the beaver survives and start to build up numbers if you give them the chance. And the same way in some other spots in Mexico.
Yeah, I've seen some extraordinary reports of how beavers are literally greening the desert in Nevada and New Mexico and Arizona and the drier parts of California, because, of course, by building the little dams that they build along the creeks and streams at the extremities of a river system, they hold the water back. And those ribbon wetlands not only hold back water for nature, but also their natural fire breaks as well. So do you see that in El Carmen? Do you see these new beaver wetlands being created away from the main body of the river?
Not yet, but it's something that perhaps we want to start to see it in the next years. But definitely something that it is very visible is their presence in the Rio Grande.
Alejandro, what's your dream for El Carmen? I mean, you've done so much. You've come such a long way in the 23 years since you've been working on this. What's the dream for you?
Well, my dream for me is that this particular landscape persists in the long way, that this is something that is something that we are working every day. And this story, and something I always say, Ben, if you read the news, there is always a lot of bad news related with nature conservation. And El Carmen Nature Reserve is a very good example of a success of conservation with the interaction of several actors from the private sector like Cemex, from government agencies like the CONAM, and government from both sides of the border, connected with a single purpose that is conservation. So my dream is that this conservation project expands their influence, and in the end, the species that we are rewilding in the place end up in different places and rewild in other places. So that's my dream, that El Carmen goes beyond their boundaries,
What's the relationship like with the population that lives in the area, and especially with the local landowners? How do they feel about all this wildlife, bison, bears, beavers, all coming back?
Well, we have a very good relationship with them, and they are used to interact with wildlife. So they feel how can I say it, in a very good way, in a proud, they feel proud about what's going on around the area. And then they want to learn more and participate in the conservation efforts. So this is how is our interactions with our neighbors,
Have you had any moments of difficult conflict? Have any ranchers really been annoyed with you, annoyed with the project on account of returning wildlife?
No, not really. We don't have any of those interactions. And the good news, Ben, is time to time I meet with one of our neighbors. And I say, Alejandro, it had been like 10 years since the last time that I saw mule deer in my property, and now they are very common. And I think the wildlife that you are producing start to get cross into our area. So this is the kind of the comments that time to time I hear. And obviously, they want to learn more on how they can steward better the properties. Sometimes we have some workshops with our neighbors in order to give them some information, or if you want to mention advice on how they can manage their properties in order they have a good balance between their traditional activities of livestock and wildlife conservation. So in general, we have good relationships.
And what if one of the big landowners adjoining El Carmen were to put their ranch up for sale? Do you think Cemex would buy more land if they could? Or would Nature Conservancy or any of the other entities with which you have worked put up the money to buy more land?
Well, I think to buy more lands, perhaps if everything are a good opportunity, we can take a look. But it's always with entities like you mentioned, perhaps another player can show up in order that we can work with them, or even TNC can show up for secure those lands. So it will be a combination, I think, of different strategies to increase the land, in if the case that the opportunity shows up.
Yeah. Alejandro, can I ask one last question of you? Did you grow up personally with a deep love of nature and wildlife? Did you always know, even from childhood, that you were going to be doing this kind of work?
Yes, since I recall, my toys were wildlife animals, and I have the fortune that I grew up in a small town near Monterrey that is called Sabinas Hidalgo, Nuevo León, that is surrounded by mountains and rivers. So I always have this connection with nature. And when I was a kid, obviously I was not with the dream to become a wildlife biologist or become a wildlife nature conservationist. But I always know that I will be working with something related with nature.
The first I heard of El Carmen was in Global Cement, a pretty random publication you might think, but it just goes to show how little we know about these amazing restoration projects that are happening all over the world. And in fact, it was that very project that spurred me to set up this Rewilding the World podcast series, to shine a light on projects like El Carmen. If you enjoyed the episode as much as I did making it, I'd be really grateful if you'd give us a like and share the podcast series with your friends and on whatever platform you use to get your podcasts. It all makes a huge difference. Next time, I'm going to be talking to a true rewilding hero, Carl Jones, a Welshman who's devoted most of his life to restoring the unique and tragically depleted nature of the island of Mauritius. There are several species, including the Mauritius kestrel, that simply wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the genius, the creativity, and the lifelong efforts of Carl Jones. Carl describes to us a place of extraordinary magic that once existed and which could be again. I hope you'll join us.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.